In this lecture, we're going to learn the difference between a felony and a misdemeanor when it comes to child support cases. Now, in all states, failure to pay your child support can be prosecuted as a crime. The difference is some states will only allow a misdemeanor charge. Other states will only allow a felony charge. So you're going to have to check out your state statute and figure out what you can do. Most states, however, allow both felonies and misdemeanors to be filed. Now, it's very likely your state is like mine. You can file a felony or a misdemeanor depending on the circumstances. Now, most of the time, those circumstances have to do with how far they are behind in payments. Now, it's pretty rare that a single missed payment or even a couple missed payments results in some kind of misdemeanor charge, let alone a felony. So what we see usually is a defendant's pretty far behind, usually 6 months to a year, maybe even 2 years behind before it actually gets referred to a child support enforcement office. Now, if your state is one of those states where you have a choice between filing a misdemeanor or a felony, obviously what you're going to look at is the amount of arrearage, or in other words, the amount of missed child support payments. So let's do an example. Let's assume that you're in a state where your statute says you can charge a felony if they miss 12 monthly payments. If that person has missed 12 monthly payments and they owe $300 a month, that means their arrearage is going to be $3,600. And in that case, you would meet the requirements of the statute and you could file a felony for that time period. However, if your defendant even made a small $1 payment and it brought their arrearage total down to $35.99, you couldn't file a felony. You'd only be able to charge a misdemeanor in this instance. So you're first going to figure out what your statute allows you to charge and what the requirements are for each of those charges. Now, here's a sample of what is available in various states. As you can see, New York, for example, they have available a misdemeanor charge where the person can be punished for 1 year in the county jail, or they can be charged for a felony, which could land them up to 4 years in the Department of Corrections. So as you look down this chart, you can see there's a wide range of charges available depending on what state you're in. Kind of interest is, for example, Idaho there. They don't have a misdemeanor charge available, or at least they didn't at the time I researched this. But they do have a felony charge available where you can get a maximum of 14 years, which is pretty stiff penalty, usually for child support. And you can compare that to North Carolina, where they have no felony charge, and the most time they can spend in jail for a misdemeanor violation is 45 days. Now, I know what you're thinking. What happens if your defendant who you're planning on charging leaves the state? Let's say you're in one of those states where you have a pretty stiff penalty and you find out your defendant has gotten notice that they could be up on charges, and so they fled the state. Well, you might want to check your state statutes. Some of the states increase the penalty if that person flees the state. And the other thing you're looking at is the time period your defendant was in the state where you're at, in your jurisdiction. So if they were there for the required time period, let's say for 6 months, and they had the required arrearage for a felony, you could still go ahead and charge that individual in your jurisdiction, even though they may have fled to a neighboring state or they fled all the way across the country. As long as your jurisdiction allows you to obtain a warrant that brings them back from that other jurisdiction, and that's going to be a felony warrant, then you have a possibility of filing those charges in your jurisdiction. Also, finally, there's possible felony charges. If you get one of these defendants that doesn't stay put very long in a state, for example, they might spend 6 months in one state, move to another state, and leave just as soon as a child support enforcement agency catches up with them, what you're probably going to have to do is get in touch with a federal prosecutor and see if you can file charges that way. And that's going to bring them back for sure. Now, granted, federal child support charges are pretty rare, but they're not impossible to obtain. So basically, as you remember from your previous studies, a felony usually results in over 1 year in the state prison system. A misdemeanor is going to usually bring the maximum penalty of less than 1 year in the local jail. For child support cases, whether or not it's a felony and a misdemeanor, it's going to depend on the amount of arrearage or the number of monthly payments that have been missed. And finally, fleeing the state usually doesn't work out well for the defendant. It's something that happens on a pretty regular basis, but usually you can bring them back if you have enough to charge a felony. If not, you might look at one of the other remedies I mentioned earlier.